Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 1 lecture. So now let's really jump into our first book of the semester, The Narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. A strange book. I want to talk a little bit about why we are starting here, of all places. Why are we starting with the account of a Spanish conquistador first published in 1542? Why is that our starting point in American literature? Well, there are several reasons. I will attempt to sort of provide a justification here. I want to start by talking about all the ways in which this book is really a first. All of the novel, original, kind of new things that this book does. So, first of all, it stands as really the first European account of what would later come to be known as the continental U.S. Now, Cabeza de Vaca is not the first explorer to have visited the U.S. mainland, what would later become the U.S. mainland, but he's really the first one to offer a detailed and sort of comprehensive account of what he saw, what he experienced, and sort of what the land has to offer. So it's a first in that respect. It is also the first detailed, well-documented account of Europeans, and in this case, one African, encountering Native Americans. Now, as we know, there had been other expeditions, other conquests in the New World before this one, in places like Mexico and Peru. So obviously you had Europeans coming into contact with Native Americans prior to this. But again, we have our first really detailed account of that type of conflict provided here. And as we know from just a sort of quick glance at American history, a big part of our history consists of this sort of collision between European culture and Native American culture. So that story is very much playing out here in the pages of this book. And also, this is the first example of what we might call expeditionary writing or a conquest narrative. It's the first example of that type of text to really foreground the customs and cultures of Native Americans. So again, other European explorers had mentioned Native Americans and had certainly entered into conflict with various Native American groups. But what Cabeza de Vaca does, which is different and unique and valuable, is he really documents a lot of what he observes, a lot of what he experiences firsthand as he encounters Native American groups and later begins to live with various Native American groups, because obviously the expedition that he takes part in does not go as planned. I'm not giving anything away, hopefully. If you guys have just read a little summary, if nothing else, you should have a basic idea of what this narrative consists of. The expedition goes off the deep end. Cabeza de Vaca and a few companions, they end up wandering through the future U.S. and parts of Mexico for somewhere around 7 years before they're able to eventually reconnect to Spanish colonists in modern-day Mexico, and they're sort of rescued, although we really have to debate whether or not that's the right word to use, because they've lived with Native Americans for a long time, and then they rediscover Spanish civilization, European civilization, and it's a bit jarring. It's a very abrupt transition for ways that we can see for ourselves as we read, and we'll talk about some of that stuff next week when we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of this text. So the way I want to lecture on the narrative here in week 1, I just want to provide kind of an introduction for you guys. I want to sort of get you ready to start reading. So I'm mostly providing some context, and I'm sort of, getting you prepared. And then next week, we'll actually discuss the content. We'll go through the events of the narrative. We'll talk about meaning. We can talk about some of the larger issues that surround this text. But I want to give everybody some time to get up and running. I know we can sometimes be a little bit slow to get started at the beginning of a semester. Some of us might still be waiting for our book to arrive. Hopefully, you've at least ordered the book, if nothing else. And if you're not getting started until later in the week, that's okay. Remember, we are devoting the first 2 weeks of the semester to this book. So you need to be finished by the end of week 2. And I do want you guys to start with the critical intro provided by our editors. And that's kind of on the long side. It's roughly 37 pages. But you need to start with that because they are doing some of the things I'm doing here. They're providing context. They're getting you ready to tackle the actual narrative. But yeah, for some of those reasons I just listed, a lot of scholars consider this text to really be the first text written explicitly about what would later become the U.S. And we can debate that. Not everybody agrees, but it seems like a logical starting place, not only because it's a first in many ways, but also because the book is really sort of quintessentially American in a lot of ways. It's telling the story of cultural collisions. And we don't have to know a whole lot about American history to know that that is a big part of our history. Different cultures, different peoples coming into contact with one another, often entering into conflict with one another, often having oppositional relationships, at least in many ways. But we have all of these different cultures coming together, fighting, but also sometimes sharing, combining, melding in various ways. And that can often be sort of considered a big part of our national narrative. The story of how America becomes America. It really is largely a story of different cultures colliding. Again, it's often violent. It's often unequal. But in some ways, a new culture will emerge when a bunch of different cultures come into contact. There's sort of an interesting process that unfolds, and we can argue as to whether or not that process is on display in this book. Many would say that it is. Other people argue that it's more conquest. It's not really cultural exchange. It's more about one culture just sort of seeking to dominate another. But maybe it's more complicated than that. We can discuss some of those questions further as we read on. But let's think a little bit about genre, because this is kind of a difficult text to classify if we're thinking about what genre it belongs to. This is not fiction. It often reads like fiction. There are a lot of sensational, improbable events that unfold over the course of this adventure. It very much is an adventure. So if we're thinking about genre, we might even call this like an adventure story. It feels like a novel at times. Again, it might seem like a curious place to start for us in a literature class, because typically in a literature class we are going to read novels, short stories, poems, but this is really nonfiction first and foremost, but it does often read like a novel. It has a plot that we might expect to find in an adventure novel. But according to Cabeza de Vaca, and according to historians who were able to verify a lot of his narrative, most of what happens here is largely, we think, true. But it can still function a little bit like an adventure novel. We can also think of it as ethnography. So that's actually a branch of anthropology. We're really getting into social science a little bit, and I'm certainly no anthropologist. I don't expect you guys to be either. But ethnography is just sort of a branch of anthropology that studies and compares different cultures. Different cultures that can be found, throughout our globe. And Cabeza de Vaca, even though that's not his background, I mean, he's a soldier, he's like a minor nobleman, he's not a social scientist, he's also not really a professional writer by trade. But he still serves in some of these roles. He still kind of functions a little bit like these things. He does document a lot of what he observes from the Native American groups that he comes into contact with. And again, a lot of previous European explorers had not really done that. They just regarded Native Americans as barbaric, very different. In some cases, they thought they were satanic. They often shunned the Native Americans and sort of dismissed most of the Native Americans, religious practices, sort of cultural practices, their customs, their traditions, their languages, their kinship, their social sort of relationships. A lot of Europeans didn't pay a lot of attention because they didn't really care, or they didn't think a lot of that stuff was important. And we sort of notice a little bit of that mentality in our man here. At the beginning of the narrative, he is a bit dismissive. He's not super detailed when describing Native Americans, but that changes. Cabeza de Vaca changes over the course of this narrative, and of course we could expect that. He's lost in the U.S. and Mexico for 7 years. He eventually starts to live with Native American groups. He begins to adopt some of their ways. And we do see a process that anthropologists might call transculturation. And that's just when multiple cultures come into contact, kind of like what I was describing a few moments ago. They collide. Sometimes there's violence. Sometimes there's, conquest and unequal exchange. But there's also a certain kind of exchange. There's a certain type of sharing that takes place between the different cultures. And, maybe we are seeing that. We might not see it until the second half of the narrative. But that's something to keep in mind, something to look out for. So in some ways, this almost functions a little bit like social science done by an amateur, not a professional, not somebody trained in those methods. They didn't really have social scientists back then. But it does function a little bit like that. It's also a captivity narrative. That's another literary genre that some of you might be familiar with. It's pretty popular in our English language tradition, but it was also popular in other places throughout the 1600s, 1700s, up until the 1800s. So in some ways, at times, Cabeza de Vaca is participating in that type of a narrative because he is a captive at times. Not always, but at times he is sort of a prisoner or even a slave. And he does narrate some of those events as well. So some of you might be familiar with Mary Rowlandson. She's perhaps the most famous example of of a captivity narrative writer in America. She was taken captive by Native Americans in late 1600s New England, and she wrote about her experiences. So this was a popular genre, like I said, in the English-speaking world and really throughout Western Europe for many centuries. And it was just, again, sort of adventure, intrigue, mystery, but they were usually true stories of people being taken captive or held hostage by hostile groups. So that was kind of a popular genre, so we see traces of that. But also, this is an expeditionary or conquest narrative, like I've mentioned. And that was, of course, a pretty popular genre during this historical time period, as the Spaniards were conquering many different parts of what, we can call the New World. New to Europeans, not new to the Native Americans, who of course were already there and had been there for thousands of years. But the Spaniards conquered Mexico, they conquered Peru pretty early in the 1500s. So with all of these different expeditions and conquests that were going on, there were always official accounts, or, basically narratives of those expeditions that had to be produced if the expedition was funded by the Spanish crown. So we have to understand that that's another way to categorize this text. It's an example of an official account of an expedition, also called a letter of relation. So in many ways, this book is a historical document as well. It wasn't really intended to be an adventurous, entertaining narrative for public consumption, although it eventually did become that. But its original purpose was as a letter of relation written to the King of Spain, King Charles, who had funded this expedition that Cabeza de Vaca is taking part in. So with any kind of official, royally funded expedition, you would always have somebody, one of the officials, one of the leaders of the expedition would be responsible for writing this letter or this official account for the king, basically documenting what they find on the expedition, the flora, the fauna, talk about the geography. You guys probably know that oftentimes a lot of these Spanish explorers were searching for gold and silver and other valuable minerals or resources. There were all these legends and stories about the vast riches to be found in what we would think of as the Americas and, the Caribbean. And in some cases, they did find gold, they did find silver, but the reports of the riches were often exaggerated. So a lot of these explorers were sometimes disappointed in their searching, but they would write these official accounts telling the king what they saw, what they did. We got into some conflict with these Native Americans. This is what the land looks like. These are the resources that we can potentially exploit. Remember, there was a real financial angle to all of this, right? As they were exploring and conquering new lands, what was to Europeans very new, they had to decide what was valuable. So they were kind of telling the king, hey, we found some valuable resources here. We can grow crops here. This looks like a place that's, good for agriculture. We're close to a natural harbor. There's lots of advantages to this area, so we should definitely colonize it. Versus, this place is kind of a desert. It's barren. We don't see a lot of resources. Maybe it's not worth our time. So there were a lot of official functions that these letters were supposed to fill, these letters of relation, these official accounts. So our man Cabeza de Vaca, he was the treasurer of the Narvaez expedition. So that's the name of the expedition that he was taking part in. In 1527, he leaves Spain to serve as a sort of high-ranking member of this expedition. So as the treasurer, it's his job to write the official account. And he does that. It takes him a long time, obviously, because he's wandering for years, but he eventually finishes the account, and that is what we are reading here. So this is a historical document, really first and foremost. It's a letter of relation. It's not a work of literature. It's not really designed principally for entertainment. It's designed for more practical purposes. And all official expeditions would have had one of these. So it's the type of text, it's not the type of text, I should say, that we would normally find in a literature class. And even though the plot could definitely work as the plot of an adventure novel, there aren't a ton of what we might call literary elements at work here. So we don't have a lot of character development. We don't have a lot of figurative language or dialogue or many of the other things that we would expect to find, in a novel or a short story. However, though that is true, what we do see is a lot of raw material that would later be shaped and molded into future fiction and film. There's actually a Mexican film based on the book, based on the adventures of Cabeza de Vaca. I might be able to post a couple of clips from that. It came out maybe in the 90s. But not even just thinking about this exact story. I'm just talking about the broad sort of themes at work here. They show up all the time. The adventure, the mystery, the violence, and this story of survival. We like survival stories in our culture. Think about it. We have a lot of movies, a lot of novels that follow a similar kind of narrative template. We follow a small band of survivors after a shipwreck or after a plane crash, or maybe it's some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario and we have a small band of survivors trying to, put together their, put society back together. We like these kinds of stories. We like to see a small sort of ragtag band of survivors overcoming obstacles, maybe working together, finding ways to survive. And that's very much what we see here. We see Cabeza de Vaca and 3 of his companions, 2 other Spaniards like him, kind of minor noblemen originally from Spain who were enlisted to serve in this expedition in the New World. And then there's the 4th survivor, Estevancio. He's actually an African guy. He's the slave of one of the other Spaniards, and he's originally from North Africa. Historians think maybe Morocco, and he was probably a Muslim who was forced to convert to Catholicism once he was captured and taken into slavery. But he accompanies, his Spanish master on this expedition, and he's one of the survivors. And his role, as the narrative unfolds, is very interesting to observe. He ends up taking on a lot of responsibility, as you'll notice in the second half of the narrative. And it seems like his function changes a bit. He's still technically somebody's property, but he becomes a very important figure. And when Cabeza de Vaca refers to him, he usually just calls him the black man. He doesn't usually refer to him by name, but his name was Estevancio. They talk about him a little bit in the introduction. So we have 4 survivors overcoming these incredible odds, facing, starvation and, exposure. They're on rafts. They shipwreck on an island off the coast of Texas. All of this crazy stuff happens to them. And we like narratives that feature those kinds of improbable escapes, adventures, but also the characters kind of change and evolve and they adapt and they learn. And that's where a lot of the most interesting stuff comes from. Their sort of process of sort of adaptation and maybe that cultural exchange that we see as European culture, Native American culture, and even African culture all sort of come together. They collide. It's not always harmonious, certainly, as we know, but there are some interesting borrowings and sharings, and maybe a kind of hybrid culture gets formed in the process. That's what some anthropologists or historians would argue, is that when you have all these cultural collisions, a new hybridized culture sort of develops by taking parts of the European, parts of the African, parts of the Native American, and now we have something new. And again, that might be largely the story of our history and the story of American culture. Again, we could call that a form of transculturation or a sort of cultural hybridity. And we might see that at work in the book, and we might see it at work throughout our own history. But again, remember, violence plays a big role in that sometimes. It's not always an equal or peaceful exchange. And certainly we see a lot of violence in the book. So we can decide if this really is transculturation or if it's mostly just conquest. So keep that question in mind. But as I'm continuing to sort of justify this as a starting place for our journey, another reason why I think it is because Cabeza de Vaca, even though he's a Spaniard, right? I mean, he's not an American in any kind of official traditional sense, but this is kind of the story of America that he's telling. We see a lot of templates, we see a lot of tropes and themes, on display here that are going to get repeated throughout the history of American literature, and we're going to be able to track some of those. But also, I feel like just thinking about him and the way he changes. In some ways, he's self-making. He's creating a new self, and that is quintessentially American in a lot of ways. So we have one version of him that we meet at the beginning, right? Like I said, he's a minor nobleman from southern Spain. He comes from a pretty old family with a little bit of money. So he's educated. He becomes a soldier. He serves the Spanish crown in Italy. And then later he's back in Spain, and that's when he gets enlisted to go on this expedition, which starts in Cuba, which the Spanish had already conquered. So he starts out as a pretty typical Spanish conquistador. He has a military background. He's pretty educated. He comes from a pretty, upper class background, and he's seeking his fortune. He's seeking fame and fortune in the New World. He's a pretty standard issue Spanish conquistador, but that's not what he remains, because the stuff that happens to him is so strange, he can't help but change. So I want you guys to notice how he changes, how his writing changes, how his observations and some of his viewpoints seem to change. And then by the end of the book, and I hope I'm not giving anything away here. I mean, you guys know that he survives. You know that he eventually makes it back to Spanish civilization. Otherwise, he would have never written the book. But when he does find other Spaniards, much later, when he and his companions finally find other Spaniards in what is now like northwest Mexico on the Pacific coast, he's not like them anymore. He's not really a recognizable Spaniard anymore. And some of that's because of the physical changes that he's undergone and all of the sort of hardships that he's survived, but also his worldview has changed. He has a different perspective on Native Americans. He's encountered a lot of different Native American cultures. That's one thing we notice in his observations, in his ethnography that he provides throughout the book, something that was lost on a lot of Europeans. He realizes that all the different Native American groups are different from one another. They don't all share a monoculture. So the Native Americans he encounters early on in the narrative are quite a bit different than the ones that he meets and then later lives with in modern day northern Mexico. So some of these tribes practice agriculture and live a lot like Europeans of the time period lived, whereas other groups are sort of semi-nomadic. Some groups have really advanced, sophisticated stuff, and they're pretty advanced cultures. Others maybe not so much, but there's a lot of difference. There's a lot of variance in terms of language, cultural practices, even the physical attributes. Certain tribes are tall, others look a little bit different. So he notices all of that, and he begins to record a lot of interesting observations. Of course, he's not right about everything, but he's interested. And he begins to recognize that a lot of these Native American groups are quite advanced and sophisticated in ways that Europeans are maybe not. So a lot of his built-in European superiority that the vast majority of conquistadors would have shared, some of that melts away over the course of his adventures. Some of that sense of cultural superiority, we're better, we have better weapons, therefore we must be the more advanced people, that mindset begins to change. And by the time he meets up with other Spaniards, he's a little bit horrified by them. He's a little bit turned off by some of their practices. But we should notice that he ultimately is still a champion of colonization. He's still a champion of expansion. He's still kind of pro-Spanish Empire. So he doesn't completely repudiate all of his previously held views, but he definitely changes. He definitely undergoes some interesting changes. But throughout the narrative, notice that he's offering a lot of personal testimony. These are mostly his own experiences. Now, he does narrate some stuff that happens to other people. other members of the expedition. But for the most part, he's focused on his own experiences, what he saw, what he did, what he went through. So there's a lot of personal testimony here, a real first-hand account. And again, that's part of the letter of relation, but it's also part of him sort of becoming something new, something different. We do see self-making. He's becoming sort of a new thing, right? And we can maybe link that to hybridization, that process of transculturation that we were talking about before. If 2 or 3 cultures come into contact, we might have a new hybrid culture that gets created. Maybe something like that is happening with him. He's bringing his old European culture. He's also adapting to a lot of aspects of Native American culture. So maybe he becomes a different kind of person, a different kind of character. And again, self-making, creating a new self, that is sort of American, right? That's what a lot of people came here to do, to seek a fortune, to start a new life, to create a new identity. And maybe that's what's happening with him as well. So just to kind of finish up talking about genre, if we're going back and thinking about these expedition narratives or conquest narratives, I want you guys to just have some historical sense of this genre, and you can see the importance of this genre, especially if we're thinking about American literature in a broader sense. If we're not just focusing on North America, but also thinking about Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, obviously there were a lot of these conquest narratives throughout the 15 and 1600s from Spanish explorers, and then later on we would get similar texts from English or even French explorers, because as we know, all of those groups were taking part in the colonization of the future U.S. I mean, the Spanish were in the future U.S., of course the English, the French were in certain parts as well, in addition to Swedes, Germans, Portuguese, all of these different European groups, plus Africans, plus Native Americans, all of these different cultures were coming into contact. But the victors, the ones who were doing the conquering, they were the ones usually writing these expedition narratives. So this genre or this tradition really starts in the 1490s with a series of letters written by Christopher Columbus. And then later we have a whole series of reports, chronicles, and histories of the conquests of Mexico and Peru. So, for example, in the early 1520s, about 5 years or 7 years before the Narvaez expedition that we're reading about, Hernando Cortez had conquered most of Mexico. So he wrote his own letter of relation, documenting his victory in Mexico and his discovery of the Pacific Ocean. You might remember the poem about stout Cortez with eagle eyes staring at the Pacific. So yeah, that's based on his own letter of relation, where he's really telling that story of the conquest of Mexico and the discovery of the Pacific. But if we're thinking about some English language equivalents, we have to move forward in time. But you can look at 1588 and a sort of account written by this guy, Thomas Harriot, called A Brief and True Report on the Newfoundland of Virginia. That comes out near the end of the 1500s. And then John Smith of Pocahontas fame, he wrote a couple of these, and we're going to look at one of them in a couple of weeks. So we're going to check out an excerpt from a description of New England, which he wrote in 1616. But he also wrote the general history of Virginia in 1624, as those areas were beginning to be colonized by the English. So Smith was doing for the English what Cabeza de Vaca is doing here for the Spanish authorities and the Spanish crown back in Spain. But again, remember that he's taking more of an interest, Cabeza de Vaca is taking more of an interest in Native American cultures. And of course, he's really experiencing some unprecedented adventures that you're not going to find in other expedition narratives. So let's talk a little bit now about geography. I really encourage you guys to check out some of the maps that you find in the book between pages 38 and 41. Because it doesn't take long to realize, once you get started reading the narrative, it doesn't take long to understand that the Narvaez expedition does not go as planned. That's where a lot of the adventure and the intrigue comes from. So it's important to understand what the expedition is trying to do versus what ends up actually happening. So you have to remember, in 1527, when this expedition is getting planned and put together, the Spanish still have a very limited understanding of the geography of mainland North America. Very limited. They have no idea how big the continent is. And that becomes painfully clear, I think, as we read on. By this point, they had explored much of the Caribbean, they had conquered Mexico, and they had also conquered Peru and some other parts of like the northern sort of sector of South America. So they had explored and conquered pretty extensively, but they didn't have much experience with the future U.S. Now, back in 1513, Ponce de Leon and his expedition, they had explored the peninsula of Florida. Okay, a place that's very important in our book. They had explored the peninsula, that they were the first Europeans to really discover the peninsula where the modern day state of Florida now is. But that expedition had really just skirted along the coast of Florida. They did land on the east coast, that's the Atlantic coast of Florida, and then they kind of moved south, staying mostly in their ships because they were too afraid to penetrate deeply into the actual, to actually get into the mainland. So they stayed on their ships, they headed south, and they probably passed through the Florida Keys before moving up to the Gulf Coast of Florida. That's the west side of the state. So the west side is the Gulf Coast, the east side is the Atlantic coast. So it's helpful to have a map as you're getting started. But so, yeah, that expedition discovered Florida, but they did not push very far into the mainland. They mostly just skirted the coast. They had a few conflicts with Native Americans, and then they left. They got spooked, and they left. So, and, fast forward 15 years to 1527, and the Spanish still don't really know the full extent of that peninsula. They don't know what lies beyond that peninsula. They really don't know the extent of North America. So that's largely what the Narvaez expedition was designed to find out. At this point, in 1527, the northernmost foothold the Spanish really had in the New World was in what is now northeastern Mexico, the modern day state of Tamaulipas. So again, if you look at a map, take a look at that northernmost extension. That's as far as the Spanish had gotten. That area in northeast Mexico, sort of between the Rio Panuco and the Rio de las Palmas. That's the area that the Narvaez expedition is trying to reach. This was like the northernmost province that the Spanish had established in Mexico. They called it Panuco. They called the province Panuco, and it was this general area between those two rivers, the Rio Panuco and the Rio de las Palmas. That's where these guys are trying to go. And that's sort of on the Gulf Coast, that northeastern part of Mexico. So that's where they're going. But as we find out, that's not where they end up. They get lost, they get turned around, they leave from Cuba, which had, like I said, had already been colonized and conquered by the Spanish. But instead of going across the Gulf of Mexico to Mexico, they end up on the peninsula of Florida. They're on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico. They're on that western coast of Florida near modern-day Tampa Bay. So it's important to understand that. Look at the map and see the difference between where they were supposed to go and where they actually go. So back then, the Spanish called everything to the north and to the east of Panuco. They called everything north and east of that Florida. And that's the italicized Florida that you're going to see repeated in the book. So anytime you see the word Florida italicized, what they are referring to is that vast, unexplored region, everything north and east of northeastern Mexico. So again, the Spanish had no idea how big that area was. They had not explored it really at all. They had sort of hugged the coastline a little bit in places like South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, but they did not know the full extent of the U.S. continent. They just had no idea. So what this expedition was supposed to do is they were supposed to land at Panuco, and then they were going to make their way north and east to explore some of that vast territory that the Spanish crown claimed as being theirs, but they had not yet explored it or mapped it or colonized it. So that was the goal. But their navigator gets confused, so they go the wrong way, and they end up on the western coast of modern-day Florida, near Tampa Bay, so on the Gulf Coast of Florida, not on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. So when you see the word Florida and it's not italicized, then you're talking about just the peninsula, the modern-day state of Florida. That's what they mean when the word is not italicized. We're talking about modern day Florida. And that's where they start out, right? They start out near Tampa Bay. But when you see Florida italicized, we're talking about that vast stretch of land that they did not know very much about, everything north and east of Panuco. So right off the bat, the Narvaez expedition is kind of snake bitten. They get hit by some big storms while they're still in Cuba, undoubtedly a hurricane. They didn't really know what hurricanes were yet. They were learning because they're very common in the Caribbean and the southeastern part of the U.S. And then they immediately go the wrong way and they land near Tampa. But if you notice, at first, they don't think they're that far away from Panuco. So they talk about going the way of Panuco. That means they're just trying to get to that northeastern Mexico province where they were supposed to land. And at first, they seem to think that they're not that far. They realize they've gone astray and they're a little bit lost. But at first, they seem to think if they just move north, again, they don't know how big the Gulf of Mexico is. So they are kind of familiar with the Gulf because they've been in Mexico. So they know how to differentiate the Gulf from like the Caribbean or the Atlantic, or even though they've also discovered the Pacific by now, but they don't know the extent of the Gulf of Mexico. They don't know how big it is. So they feel like, okay, Panuco is probably just around the bend. We just need to kind of go up and over a little bit and we'll hit Panuco. It's no big deal. Because again, they have no concept of scale or distance. They have no idea how far away they are from Panuco. I think it slowly dawns on them as the journey continues. But from Tampa, they do go a little bit inland, but mostly they kind of stick close to the coast of Florida and they start moving north. And they eventually end up in the Florida Panhandle, that kind of weird skinny part of Florida that's like right underneath Alabama and a part of Mississippi. So they're kind of hugging the coast. They eventually end up on these man-made rafts. That's when things really start to get hairy for them. They're on these rafts. They're withstanding storms and a lack of food. They lose some of the rafts, but they're basically tracking along the coastline of the Gulf, up around like places like Biloxi, Mississippi, the southern parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, and then eventually Cabeza de Vaca and a few of his companions, they end up shipwrecked on an island off the coast of Texas. Okay, near Galveston. So that's where the really wacky stuff begins for him and his fellow survivors. But there are some other survivors spread out along the Gulf Coast. Some of them stay behind, like in modern day Louisiana. We don't really know what happened to some of those guys. They either died or they just lived the rest of their lives with Native Americans, most likely. But Cabeza de Vaca and his guys, his three companions, they all end up either on the Texas mainland or on this island right off the coast of Texas. And from there, they start to go south. It takes them a while, but eventually they start moving south and they enter Mexico eventually, and they end up not very far from Panuco. But instead of continuing to go south, and they would have hit Panuco eventually if they had just kind of stuck to that northeastern coast of Mexico, instead they go across Mexico. And we'll talk more about that decision they make to change their route. Because again, they're never 100% sure of where they're going. They're trying to get to Panuco. They're never really solid on how to get there, but they kind of get a sense that they're kind of moving around the Gulf, and if they keep going, they might hit it. But then they change their mind largely because they're encountering a lot of hostile Native American tribes. So they start to go inland. They go west, and they end up crossing the entire country of modern-day Mexico. They come into contact with more peaceful Native American groups, and that's really where the transculturation might kick in. But we're not there yet. We'll talk more about that next week. So just be aware of the geography. I would look at the maps in the book. You might want to pull up a map of Mexico or just a map that shows you the sort of Gulf of Mexico and the land around it, so you have an idea of where they are and just how much ground they are really covering. The sheer scope of their travels is staggering. And of course, it takes them 7 years to make it from the Gulf Coast of Florida all the way to the Pacific Coast in northwestern Mexico. That's where they end up, not far from modern-day Sinaloa in northwest Mexico, near the Pacific. So it's pretty amazing, and we'll talk more about the details of their travels, why they go certain ways, and what they encounter. But again, another thing they notice is that, and we notice as readers, is that some of the Native American groups they encounter are friendly and help them, keep them alive in many cases, and then in other cases they are captured and enslaved by more hostile, warlike Native American groups. So their fortunes, the fortunes of the survivors really depend on who they're with. If they're with hostile tribes, they're either on the run or they're slaves. If they're with more friendly tribes, they're treated better, and later they even assume really important positions within the social structure of some of these tribes, especially once they get down into Mexico. So we'll talk more about that next week. So, like I said, I know we might be a little slow to get started, so I don't want to talk about anything else really specific to the narrative until we can all read and make some progress, and then next week I'll try to cover pretty much everything from a thematic and structural standpoint, all the stuff we need to know moving forward. But for now, I just want to close by talking a little bit about this edition and some of the different versions of this official account, this letter of relation, this adventure narrative, whatever you want to call it. It exists in many different forms. And like I said, the reason we like this version is because it was put out by two really good scholars. It's recent, it's modern. But this is a recreation of the 1542 letter of relation that Cabeza de Vaca wrote right after he got back to Spain. So he was working on it probably between like 1538 and 1540, and then it was published in 1542. So that's what we're looking at here. But there are other versions of this story. In 1536, he actually wrote a joint account with the other two Spaniards who survived the expedition. And we'll talk more about these guys next week, but Castillo and Dorantes were the other two Spaniards who survived. And then remember, it was also Estevancio, the slave from North Africa. But of course, Estevancio was excluded from the official account, and it was just the three Spaniards who were all kind of minor noblemen, kind of had pretty high-ranking positions in the expedition. They were asked to write an account of what happened. So Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, and Dorantes wrote that while they were still in Mexico in 1536, not long after they were discovered by other Spaniards. They wrote that joint account. But then our guy goes back to Spain and he writes his own version. The 1542 account is Cabeza de Vaca writing alone. This is his account. So that's what we see here, and it's kind of spruced up and presented in a more modern way for modern readers, but our editors do not change his language. They do not change any of the real substance of the story. They're just presenting it in a more clear fashion. But also, in 1555, another version came out, a newer edition of the narrative came out. We're not using that, but one nice thing about that 1555 edition is the fact that it included descriptive chapter titles. And unfortunately, the 1542 edition does not have chapter titles or really clear chapter breaks of any kind. But you might notice that our editors did us the favor of including those descriptive chapter titles from the 1555 edition in our edition. So if you look in the margin of the pages next to the letter V, you'll be able to tell whenever you come to a new chapter, because they provide those chapter titles next to the letter V. So for example, if you're looking on page 74, you'll notice that that's the beginning of chapter 9. And the descriptive title for chapter 9 is also given, How We Departed from the Bay of Horses. So we don't have those in the 1542 edition, but he later added those, or maybe his editor back in 1555 added those, so we get those descriptive chapter titles in the margins. They're kind of small, but you can find them and you can use them if you need chapter breaks. If you want a logical stopping place, you can use the chapter breaks to provide that. And one final thing to remember. After that 1536 joint account written by him and the other two Spaniards, a historian named Oviedo later used that joint account to write a much bigger history of the Spanish conquest of the New World, talking about the Caribbean, Mexico, South America, and a little bit of North America, because he talks about Cabeza de Vaca. So Oviedo was a Spanish historian, well respected, a really good scholar, and he's using that joint account written by three of the survivors, he's using that as a basis for his history. It was one of his primary sources when he was writing his larger history of the Spanish in the New World. It was not his only source, but it was one of his sources. So you're going to notice that our editors reference Oviedo in the footnotes. They actually use his history to sort of cross-check and verify a lot of the events being described by Cabeza de Vaca, because it's important to note that there were some small discrepancies between what we see in that joint account written in 1536, written by all three guys, versus the account that Cabeza de Vaca writes by himself several years later. So we can note those discrepancies by referring back to Oviedo's history. And that's what the editors do from time to time in the footnotes. So don't get confused. You're not expected to have read Oviedo's history. You're not expected to really be familiar with it. Just understand what it is and understand that it's a pretty well-researched, pretty accurate history. So we're using it to kind of cross-check this account written by Cabeza de Vaca, and we will see on occasion there are interesting changes that might tell us something about how Cabeza de Vaca is trying to present himself, because remember, a letter of relation or an official account of an expedition was really addressed directly to the king, or to whatever royal official funded the expedition, but often that would be the king. And in this case, it's King Charles of Spain. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those discrepancies between the 1536 and 1542 versions. But just remember, we are reading the 1542 version with the help of our editors. So use that critical apparatus that they provide. Okay, read the critical introduction. I'm giving you some time this week to read that critical intro, so be sure to do that. That's partly why we're spending 2 full weeks on this text. So read the critical intro and use the footnotes at the bottom of the pages. They are helpful. Good luck. We'll come back next week and talk about meaning and lasting significance of this text. But in the meantime, just read as much as you can. It's okay if you're not finished when you're tuning into my lecture next week, but just be sure to finish the book by the end of next week. So let me know if you have any questions, if you're having any issues getting the book. Let's talk, and I will see you next week.